Is it not manifest that in the larger bodies of professed Christians, what is called, quote, open, free Catholic communion, unquote, is practiced, and closed communion is by them matter of reproach heaped upon others? While they inconsistently pretend to have subordinate standards, at least to bind their office-bearers? Now, the Lord says to each of his children, quote, "Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil," unquote. Yet the pernicious example of these large, wealthy, fashionable, worldly churches has evidently corrupted the smaller and sounder ones. And this example, together with impious earthly politics, has infected the professed public witnesses for the whole of the covenanted work of Reformation. Of this corrupting influence, these self-styled witnesses have furnished undeniable evidence in Scotland, Ireland, and America, by the ministers breaking all forms of the most solemn pledges and openly identifying in fellowship with the very parties against whose errors and consequent immoralities they had testified. These are facts, I say, and undeniable facts, in all the three lands named, and they are for a lamentation. Of course, I approve of all or any in those bodies who maintain their integrity, and whose forebodings, like my own, are that their number is yet to be farther reduced. This was the mind of the late Reverend W. Somerville, and others. And how can anyone forecast otherwise, who perceives the apathy of the residuary ministers when one of their number elopes and turns renegade? Reverend T.M. Elder sends a letter to his synod informing his brethren that he has, quote, left their communion, unquote. What censure follows upon this open violation of ordination and other solemn vows? Why just drop his name from the roll? The interpretation is, synod does not regard terms of communion any longer as involving moral obligation or as a bond of fellowship. The same tendency to latitudinarianism is, in that body, farther evinced by the late retiring moderator in his synodic sermon for reading, which, instead of preaching, he was but too mildly rebuked by his brethren. This bold and intolerant innovator had incorporated in his pompous and self-contradictory essay the following sentiment, quote, "No branch of the church has a divine warrant to disfellowship a single child of God who is living a God-honoring Christian life," unquote. This is seemingly a truism, and without analyzing the words it will command a general assent. Yet it certainly cost its author much anxious thought how to conceal its sophistry from detection, and indeed it might be difficult to find anywhere in so few words such a tissue of errors compromised. To say nothing of the vague and popular, because unscriptural, phrase, quote, branch of the church, unquote, it may be asked, how did Reverend David Gregg, who could not preach a synodic sermon, discover, quote, a child of God, unquote, without a scripture test? How does he know that anyone fears or honors God without that test? That he is, quote, living a Christian life, unquote, without trial by Bible, creed, or any external rule? Oh, he knows every real Christian at sight by what the learned call intuition. Mr. Gregg has evidently no taste for a costume of sackcloth or the seclusion of a wilderness condition, and as little for creeds or any other human trammels on a man of, quote, broad views, unquote. Section 2. After tracing some of the fruits of departure from the, quote, footsteps of the flock, unquote, in different hands, it will be requisite to trace these to their source, and mark with more distinctiveness and successive and progressive steps of defection. And here my labor will bear some resemblance of that, quote, old morality, unquote. And here a footnote. In Tales of My Landlord, Sir Walter Scott introduced and gave me special prominence to a fictitious character by this name. The novelist was, in politics, of the party called by historians Tories, the patrons of arbitrary power in the state, allied to the lordly prelacy in the church. The opposite party were known by the name of Whigs, the advocates of constitutional rights and popular liberty. The Covenanted Presbyterians of Scotland were always found in the front rank of this party of social progress. Of course, the novelist had no sympathy with the Covenanters. His, quote, tales, unquote, etc., betray betray the bitter hostility of the writer to the Covenanters, and display the fertility of his imagination to blacken their character and expose them to ridicule. Old morality is portrayed as laboriously and affectionately renewing, with chisel and mallet, the inscriptions on the tombs of the martyrs, which time had partially obliterated. Sir Walter's sagacity as a worldly politician is equal to his ingenuity as a novelist in selecting an original for his caricature. Well did the wizard know what kind of Samuels to conjure up for the purpose of deceiving and misleading his admiring and credulous patrons. Many learned and godly men, sympathizing more or less with the cause of the Scottish martyrs, have, quote, done worthily in Ephraim and become famous in Bethlehem, unquote, by their historical writings, as Cruikshank, Woodrow, Hetherington, Macree, and many others. Yet none of them has embalmed the memory or transmitted the testimony of those noble and patriotic witnesses, as was done by the loving labor of an obscure and comparatively illiterate individual. This was John Howe of Lochgoin, an eminently godly man, and for his numerous and trustworthy writings, worthy to be ranked among the first three. From him, subsequent and learned historians have derived whatever is authentic in their useful works, as, quote, Scots Worthies, unquote, and, quote, Ladies of the Covenant, unquote, etc. In Scotland, the Mother Church, Reformed Presbyterian, was the first to degenerate. In the latter part of the last century, the mystery of iniquity did already work. Even before ministers had become numerous enough to organize a synod, some of them began to court popularity and agitate for greater liberty. Reverend Adam Brown of Crookedholme appears to have been the leader in backsliding. As usual, he kept in the dark for a time, operating through the instrumentality of tools prepared by himself. It was well known from the, quote, Register of the General Meeting, unquote, that prior to the year 1712, the Society people had used the rules of admission to their fellowship drawn up by Mr. James Renwick. And it was also known from equally authentic sources that the Arkansas Renovation was a term of communion from 1712 till 1741, and after the constitution of the Reformed Presbytery till the adoption of the first judicial testimony in 1761, in which all the preceding attainments are expressly approved and formally sanctioned. For a period of about 20 years after the testimony was published, no open attack was made upon any of the recognized standards of the Church. The leaven was working in secret, however, through the influence of the aforesaid Mr. Adam Brown. This is manifest from the fact that about the year 1797, quote, 3 persons appeared before the Presbytery with petitions that had a native tendency to blacken the Reformation period and introduce sectarian principles, but as they did not get satisfaction, they went off to other parties, unquote. Quote, in August 1798, 6 members of the congregation of Crookedholme, no doubt prompted by Mr. Brown, gave in a petition to the Presbytery, tending to the disparagement of the work of Reformation as carried on by our worthy ancestors. Yet, notwithstanding this, it was received by the Presbytery, and the petitioners allowed to receive church privileges. I have now quoted from authentic documents, and a great deal more is at hand, of which I intend to make some farther use. Yet the reader can already see that a course of declension had begun at the date specified. Quote, it is said the Presbytery exerted themselves to give the petitioners satisfaction by publishing the explanation and defense of the terms of communion, unquote. This was carnal policy, a temporizing expediency, instead of prompt and merited censure, as had been done by one session only 2 years before. I now quote again to establish this truth, quote, certain members of the Glasgow congregation in 1796 were dealt with by the session for occasional hearing. The case was referred to the Reformed Presbytery, who remitted the case to the session, ordering these members to be censured by the session. The Presbytery, in their next meeting, adhered to their former sentence. The parties accused declined the authority of Presbytery, unquote. Is it not evident that the Presbytery judged occasional hearings censurable in 1796? And how could they so determine unless they considered it a breach of solemn vows and a violation and contradiction of their own testimony? A practical subversion of their distinctive profession. And I believe the Presbytery, the highest court then in the Church, judged righteously and faithfully in supporting the authority of their sessions, and I also believe that every honest man and woman of competent intelligence will be of the same mind. I have said elsewhere that the practice of waiting on the ministry of those churches whose ministers and members have, quote, gone out from us, unquote, and against whose errors and corruptions we have publicly and solemnly testified, is at once a practice sinful, uncharitable, contradictory, and suicidal, as well as tending to all other moral evils and social disorders. Again I quote, "The disaffected people of Crookedholme, congregation in 1814, defection increasing, petitioned synod for some alteration in the terms of communion, an individual having taken offense at a neighboring minister explaining the fourth article of the terms relative to the Alcansall covenanting," unquote. They had now grown to a synod, but, quote, "the session would not transmit this petition, asking some alteration in the terms," unquote. That was so far well, but the restless and persevering innovators, the very next year, 1815, demanded still more liberty. Quote, "They earnestly requested that the synod would render the testimony more concise," unquote. It appears that this petition met with opposition in the presbytery, having little aid from any of the ministers but, except Mr. Brown and the elder from his congregation, yet they had the influence to get it read in a private way before the members of synod, unquote. This was another grievous concession to backsliders on the part of synod, and prepared the way for accelerated defection. This is evident, for in the year 1816, the synod received said petition, and entered upon the consideration of two articles thereof, namely, the leaving out of the clause in the fourth article of the terms relative to Alcansall deed, and remodeling the testimony. And Mr. Brown was so successful at this time that he obtained a majority of votes to new model the testimony. The matter was deferred, however, till another opportunity, because the ministers were not unanimous. The synod had two meetings in 1816, each of which these matters came before them, and though the report of the different sessions relative to the propriety of a new testimony and expunging of Alcansall deed was far from favorable, yet the synod acted in such a forward manner that they appointed a new committee to prepare the draft of a new testimony. In May 1819 the synod did nothing in this business, as the opinion of the Church in Ireland was not come forward. Yet the Reverend Professor John Macmillan of Stirling and Reverend W. Grieve, by their letters, cast all the arguments advanced by the innovators, then termed New Lights, into the shade. The Reverend James Reed, in his speech, gave his hearty approbation of the two letters, and said the change of the fourth term of communion, if carried into effect, would give him much trouble. A committee of the whole synod met in 1820 to examine the draft of a new testimony, and in April following it was published. In 1822 the fourth term of communion was changed, and after many alterations in the overture of a new testimony, or a total change thereof, this testimony appeared not till 1836 through 1838, omitting to forbid the practice of, quote, occasional hearing, unquote. Thus, in as concise form as possible, I have adduced the evidence of eye-witnesses and of the very actors themselves to the various steps of retrogression by the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Men of corrupt minds, among whom Mr. Brown distinguishes himself, were unceasing in their private intrigues, and as they gathered more confidence from partial success, became open advocates of their schemes of worldly conformity.